Welcome to Around the Weird. Here's your host, the museum curator of the strange and unusual, Mr. Nothing.
Thank you, Mysterious Voice, and welcome back to Around the Weird, a booktube channel where I talk about all the unusual and out of the ordinary literature that I found in my travels. Today I want to talk about a poem that I read because it is Poetry Thursday, a pretty high quality poem from a familiar author, one that is about death. I am referring to Because I Could Not Stop for Death by Emily Dickinson. I've talked about Emily Dickinson on this channel before, so I don't need to go into that great of detail, but she was a poet who lived in the 1800s, got a few things published in her time, but most of her work was published after her death, and it always brings up the usual question of, was that a good thing to do, or was it exploitative that they were basically, the people who came after her were just seeking to make a lot of money off her after her death. It seems kind of weird, but I've always been sort of drawn to Emily's poems because they feel very raw emotion there. A lot of talk of sadness and melancholy, really capturing something that I think a lot of people feel from time to time. A very interesting poet. And I'm actually surprised I haven't talked about this poem before because this is one of my favorite poems. So I was surprised to find that this was like a gap in my Dickinson poem talking about experience on this channel. Other people have talked about Emily Dickinson's this poem before on especially the Codex Cantina boys over at the Codex Cantina. They've offered some pretty interesting insight, and I'll link to their video in the description below. So let me know what you think of their video as well. Without further ado, let's talk about Because I Could Not Stop for Death. I will read it, do a little bit of analysis, and we will move on from there. Because I could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for me. The carriage held but just ourselves and immortality. We slowly drove, he knew no haste, and I had put away my labor and my leisure too, for his civility. We passed the school where children strove, at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain, we passed the setting sun. Or rather, he passed us. The dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. We paused before a house that seemed a swelling of the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. Since then 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. So that was Because I Could Not Stop for Death. In terms of analysis, there's a fair bit to talk about with this poem. And in terms of narrative, it seems pretty simple to understand. The narrator cannot stop for death, whatever that means. I think they might be a little busy with their life, not really thinking, not really pausing to reflect on anything. And death just simply comes for them, possibly when they're least suspecting it. And so metaphorically, as they're driving to the afterlife, they, like the narrator kind of goes with death through the stages of what appears to be life. They go through school where the children strove and recess in the ring, and in the fields of gazing grain, possibly where they're working as an adult, and then they eventually go to their death. And it feels like centuries to the narrator. Specifically, they say, since then 'tis centuries, and yet feels shorter than the day I first surmised the horses' heads were toward eternity. And so what I feel like that means is just like the narrator is only beginning to realize how long they've been sort of stuck in this afterlife, in this whatever world that they exist in that's after death. And I do like how the narrator kind of draws attention to the different stages of life. They say, we passed the school where children strove, at recess in the ring. We passed the fields of gazing grain, we passed the setting sun. Specifically, the term setting sun definitely highlights a coldness, a feeling of death. And then they also give other clues in the poem about what their fate could be. They specifically say, the dews drew quivering and chill, for only gossamer my gown, my tippet only tulle. And so there you see the narrator talking about their dress, and the way that it's described is described as something that, someone who's dead might wear, like something that you're wearing in the crypt, especially if you're a young woman, as Emily Dickinson was. And then they, in the next verse, they say, we paused before a house that seemed a swelling in the ground. The roof was scarcely visible, the cornice in the ground. And so what kind of house would swell in the ground? What kind of house would have a cornice, sort of decoration on the roof? And the answer to that is a crypt. So again, noting where the narrator is going after they're dying, essentially being deposited in the crypt, just to have their funeral rites read and spend the rest of their life in the afterlife. And so you get a feeling for this poem, how completely entombed the narrator is. And for Emily Dickinson to just describe it this way, it really seems like she's watched a lot of death in her life, kind of enmeshed and surrounded by that, and kind of getting at the feeling that maybe she's not long for this world herself. So pretty depressing, a little bit sad too, in that regard. But ultimately, I really like this poem because it manages to capture that sort of dark and gloomy atmosphere that comes with death. And just saying, because you could not stop for death, he kindly stopped for you, is one of the hardest lines I've ever read in poetry. Anyway, those are my thoughts on Because I Could Not Stop for Death. Pretty excellent poem, one that I definitely recommend that you go out and read. One of my favorite poems of all time, and certainly one of Emily's best. So absolutely worth reading and discussing. And if you're in a classroom setting or something like that, it's worth sharing with other people. Comment below if you have any thoughts on my review or the poem in general. Otherwise, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe so that other people can find out about this poet or this poem if they do not already know. Join the Discord if you want to have further conversations about poetry and media and stuff like that. And until then, I wish you the best of luck in your weird and not stopping for death travels. Farewell.